Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the latest in our book talk series from the European Parliamentary Research Service. I'm Anthony Teasdale from the EPRS, and it's a great pleasure to have as our guest today Professor Vivien SCHMIDT from Boston University. Now, Vivien is not a newcomer, in fact, to this series. She very kindly presented one of her previous books, which was awarded the status of being one of the 100 books to remember on Europe, written since the Second World War by EPRS, and that was Democracy in Europe, the EU and National Polities, which made a huge impact when it was published a couple of decades ago, and it analyses, in effect, the interaction between the EU level and national levels in the multi-layered EU system. And she's now taken that analysis further forward by looking in detail at the interaction between different players, national and European, in the eurozone debt crisis. And it's called Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. And I strongly recommend it to anybody who's interested not only in the Eurozone and EMU, but also in the operation of the EU political system, because Vivien is one of those few figures really in EU studies today who looks at the totality of the political system and how it changes over time. And who better to have in conversation with her, as on the previous occasion about 18 months ago when we looked at democracy in Europe, than Jim Cloos, who's just retired after a very long and distinguished career in the European Civil Service. He's just retired from the Council Secretariat, where he was Deputy Director General for Horizontal Questions, and of course a legendary figure in terms of his writing and attempt to ensure that the meetings of the European Council were steered through the conclusion which heads of state and government pronounced. Jim is now the Secretary General of TEPSA, which is the Trans-European European Policy Studies Association that looks at EU issues from the point of view of a variety of think tanks and academic bodies. And it's a great pleasure to have Jim back again to act once again as a discussant on one of Vivien SCHMIDT's books. Now, you haven't come to hear from me, but just to say I think we're in for a cracking discussion, and I'd like to pass the microphone over to Vivien so she can talk a little bit about her book, its central thesis and conclusions, and a little bit also perhaps about why you wrote the book and how you see it in the broader picture of your thinking about the evolution of the EU political system. I'll then ask Jim to ask a few questions, critique a little bit the book which he's just been reading, and then over to you, the digital floor, the audience. We have currently about 65 people online. Normally it goes up a little bit. To ask you to ask questions or make comments from the digital floor. And the best way to do that is to pose your question in the chat function. And as always, I'll try and pick up as many of these as I can in the time that we have available for Q&A after our two guests have spoken. So over to Vivien.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Delighted to be here. Thanks to Jim also for commenting. So my book is about legitimacy, and it's, as the title suggests, governing by rules and ruling by numbers in the Eurozone. And I was basically, I suppose, obsessed since 2010 about the Eurozone crisis and trying to understand what was going on and why. And I began to think that actually legitimacy was the best lens through which to evaluate the EU's crisis. Actually, not just this crisis, but others as well. In part because I wanted to bring together the political economy, the politics, and the governance procedures, and to talk about how they relate and they interrelate. So what I found about the crisis is that this was not just a crisis about economics or politics, it was also about legitimacy. What we saw between 2010 and 2012 in particular was essentially governing by rules and ruling by numbers. What this meant is that legitimacy was at risk as a result of deteriorating economics and increasingly toxic politics. But of course, it doesn't stop here. By 2013, after Draghi's famous phrase, "I'll do whatever it takes to save the euro," the crisis slowed. And that's when, and essentially between 2013 and 2015, we see that EU actors, EU institutional actors, begin reinterpreting the rules and numbers, but they do so by stealth, without admitting it. The result was incremental improvement, but you still had the suboptimal rules and perceptions of illegitimacy. From 2015 on, yes, everyone admitted to the reinterpretation, so that produced more legitimacy, but the damage was already done. So in order to discuss what I mean by legitimacy, I thought it's useful to share a couple of slides. So hopefully, here we go. Hopefully, looks like I managed to do this right. So there you get a slide of the book and the title. But essentially, how do we define legitimacy? And often the definition of legitimacy is legitimacy as a governing authority. This is essentially based in public consent, in citizen trust in a government. And that's often at the national level, but one could argue equally that its supranational institutions can also have governing authority. But that's a very basic way, and it's important to flesh this out by adding legitimacy as governing activity. And here, one often talks about governing activities and legitimacy involved in terms of policy effectiveness and performance, the political responsiveness of governing bodies, but also citizen participation, and finally also the procedural quality of governance. So the question would be, before we get into the details of democratic legitimacy, the question would be, is the EU itself democratically legitimate as a governing authority? I argue in the book that yes, actually, because what you see is in policy area after policy area, the EU gains governing authority through governments' agreement and citizens' tacit public or political consent. But is the EU legitimate as a democracy? Well, that's more complicated because, of course, the EU is not what we normally think of as a democracy. But of course, the EU is democratic. It is made up of member states that are democracies, and after all, the EU is its member states in a very real sense. But is the EU democratically legitimate in terms of its governing activities? And here, of course, once we look into the eurozone crisis, it becomes questionable. But before we dive into that, I'd just like to delve slightly more deeply into how we can think about legitimacy in EU governing activities. And I thought useful to have a slide so you get a sense of how these different kinds of criteria that one uses for legitimacy work. So as noted just before, legitimacy is political, it's about performance, and it's about procedural. So here I'm using the EU studies systems theory terms that I think most of you are probably familiar with. Output legitimacy is a performance criterion, and it's about policy effectiveness and performance. Are there good outcomes, etc. Next is input legitimacy, which is a political criterion. This is about political representation and, of course, government's responsiveness. And here, and it's important to note that between output and input, there are trade-offs. Often we think of, basically, even if the citizens don't know about a policy, haven't voted for it, but it works, then that policy is legitimate. Or alternatively, citizens have voted for a really stupid policy, it doesn't work, but they voted for it, so it's still legitimate. Those are the trade-offs. But what about throughput legitimacy? This is a procedural criterion. It's about the quality of the processes. So it's all of the terms that we all use. It's about efficacy, accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, openness. And what I've done with this category of throughput legitimacy, which is one you might not have heard of, is try to group together all these different kinds of procedural criteria in order to be able to say, well, what's the relationship between the procedural and the political and the performance aspects? And importantly here, and this is especially important for civil servants, there are no trade-offs. Essentially, if you have good throughput quality of the processes, it's almost invisible. Whereas if the processes, the procedures are perceived as incompetent, biased, and oppressive, they can actually taint the perceptions of the politics, of the input legitimacy, and they can skew or also taint output legitimacy. And I think this is really important, especially at the level of the EU, because there's often an assumption, all we have to do is do a good job with our procedures and we'll have good output, and therefore everyone will be happy. Well, not exactly, because actually throughput cannot make up for a lack of input or problematic input or output, but it can, in effect, cause problems for both input and output if it itself is problematic. So that's the sort of the general terms that I'm using in the book. But how do we apply it specifically to the EU? And here, very interestingly, the EU has a kind of split level legitimacy in the sense that it's at the EU level that you have primarily output and throughput legitimacy, and the national level input legitimacy. Of course, in the European Parliament, obviously, you also have input legitimacy, but generally speaking, people vote at the national level. Their primary identity is at the national level. As a result, sort of the main input legitimacy is primarily at the national level, whereas the EU does a lot more in terms of trying to make sure that it does proper procedures and also has good performance. And what we've seen, and this is from my 2006 book that Anthony kindly mentioned, I talked about that this kind of split was essentially at the national level, one had increasingly politics without policy, meaning that increasingly policies were taken up to the EU level, hollowing out national politics. At the same time that the EU had policy without politics, because it was essentially focused on policy with relatively little politics. What we've seen subsequently, we're talking 14 years, 15 years later, that the EU has moved at the national level from politics without policy to, in a number of areas, politics against policy. At the same time that the EU has gone from policy without politics to policy with politics. So what do I mean by that? I'm talking about, as I think we all know, the politicization of eurozone governance. At the bottom, we've seen growing Euroscepticism from the bottom up, especially in the Council, and increasingly constraining dissensus, making it increasingly difficult to arrive at positive decisions. And of course, at the top itself, what I see as a newly politicized dynamics of interaction. Now, you know that scholars have often debated, and you probably yourselves in the institutions have debated, who's in charge. Is it intergovernmentalism? Is it the Council in charge? Or rather supranational, the Commission and the ECB are in control? Or on the contrary, look at the European Parliament. It's been gaining increasing influence. So scholars essentially say it's one or the other. And for me, actually, we're seeing a new politicized dynamics of interaction amongst all actually increasingly empowered actors. And I think this is really what's important. And you see it in a kind of politicization that can be often negative, as member state leaders complain about the Commission and engaging in administrative discretion, or you can even see the European Parliament increasingly criticizing the Commission or the Council for what it does. That's politicization. So I guess the big question, before we move on to look more deeply into the various actors, is politicization a good thing or a bad thing? Now, there are many who have argued it's a bad thing, and certainly the substance of the argument tend to be delegitimizing, as Wolfgang Schäuble complains about, for example, complains about the Commission doing what it shouldn't be doing, according to him. And you see it in all sorts of ways, the kind of politicization in terms of the substantive content. But on the other hand, you could say, but what about the processes? There is more political discussion, there's more interaction, and that not just interaction, more deliberation and contestation, but isn't that what democracy is all about? Certainly that's what we're used to at the national level. So perhaps this is simply the EU becoming more democratic in its processes and perhaps more democratically legitimate as a result. But once having said that, we'll end the slideshow. Now I have to figure out how to get.
Good.
So once we've gotten the sort of the general issues, I'd like to turn to the eurozone crisis. And, perhaps I should just give you a stylized view of the crisis in terms of these criteria. Essentially, all EU actors assumed they needed to do was double down on the rules, thus provide procedural throughput legitimacy. They then assumed they would have good results, output performance legitimacy, so it didn't matter that they were not responsive to the people, i.e., no political input legitimacy. But very soon, what we saw was poor output, so deteriorating economics, and problematic input, a rising political revolt. And that's when, by 2013, you see the reinterpretation of the rules. But as I mentioned earlier, by stealth, without admitting it. And the result was, yes, better performance, but still suboptimal rules and perceptions of illegitimacy, a discourse that denied any reinterpretations of the rules. But with this sort of thing, just to give you an example, the Spaniards felt oppressed, even when accommodated, and the Germans felt deceived regardless. So it's true that from 2015 on, there's EU institutional actors, in particular the Commission, admitted to its reinterpretations for legitimacy, and it created rules for flexibility, mind you, but the damage, as I mentioned earlier, was already done. So how do we think about these EU different actors' different pathways to procedural legitimacy? Because, of course, each has a different sense of its own legitimacy and the way in which to arrive there. And so confronting this, I thought to myself, how do I deal with these issues of legitimacy? And I thought that the best way to do it was to try to provide a kind of balanced view, a Janus-faced view, providing all the arguments on one side that say this is problematic, and all the arguments on the other side saying no. So illegitimate, legitimate. So for the Council, I asked the question, was the Council a dictator led by Germany and a Northern European coalition, providing for one-size-fits-one rules? Or rather, was it a deliberative body, a mutually accountable deliberative body? So on the dictator side, there are lots of arguments that, yes, indeed, it was a dictatorship led by Germany. The Council, after all, was not an input representative forum, even though you had EU leaders saying this, Merkozy, and in particular Sarkozy, saying, oh, this is the most democratic way of deciding, we in the Council. And in this context, Germany seemed the biggest winner. It was in its economic interest as a creditor, forcing the debtors to pay and not allowing for a transfer union. It was in its political interest, certainly in the run-up to, as the Greek crisis was heating up, because of various elections, and of course, legal interests in terms of the German Constitutional Court. And in this context, France was missing in action after an initial push for solidarity. Sarkozy basically does the deal with the devil, if you will, remembering his own conservative constituency, and then you got Merkozy. So that's on the dictatorship side. But what about a mutually accountable deliberative body? After all, if you think about it, everyone did agree on the rules at reinforcing the rules. Even if we could say that deliberation was in the shadow of Germany. And the discourse itself, if you think about it, in 2010, it went from, it certainly was a discourse of stability, arguably dictated by Germany, but by 2012, you get a shift to growth, and this is Mario Monti going up to Brussels and saying, we need growth, and Hollande saying, yes, yes, we need growth. That was 2012. By 2014, it's flexibility, as Matteo Renzi goes to Brussels to say, we need flexibility, and Hollande says, yes, yes, we do. And by 2015, it's investment with the Juncker Commission. Certainly, this would suggest that there's mutual accountability here, as Germany doesn't get everything it wants. So no, it's not a dictatorship. And perhaps it is a deliberative body. And I think one could make arguments on both sides pretty credibly in terms of legitimacy for normal countries. But what about the program countries? Here, actually, I see it either as harsh dictatorship, and in this case, I take the third Greek bailout, or deliberative authoritarianism, the first two Greek bailouts, Ireland and Portugal. So not any legitimacy there. But now, next, what about the European Central Bank? Was it the hero of the crisis, moving from one-size-fits-none rules to whatever it takes, in Mario Draghi's words? Or was it the ogre, imposing austerity and structural reform? Again, good arguments on both sides. As the hero, the ECB managed to go from a very, very narrow interpretation of what it could do. No, we have to be credible. No, we can't be a lender of last resort. To a switch in focus to a focus on the medium term in terms of stability, and actually moving by 2015 to quantitative easing. Beyond that, one could say that for the ECB, it was output performance is key. But what about the other side? Hero, everyone thought Super Mario and all of that. But what about austerity and structural reforms? After all, one could argue just as well, and there are those who did it, that the ECB was the ogre. It lacked accountability as it demanded a quid pro quo on fiscal consolidation. Okay, I'll save the euro, but in exchange, you need to engage in austerity and harsh structural reform in the case of program countries. There was a lack of transparency, most particularly in terms of Jean-Claude Trichet's secret letters to heads of state. That was arguably also input illegitimate, as it forced countries into conditionality. Beyond that, there was certainly a lack of efficacy. The ECB waited incredibly long to becoming a lender of last resort and doing quantitative easing. If you remember, starting in 2008, the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England all started massive throwing money at the problem, as it were, quantitative easing. And it took the ECB until 2015 to do that. And what about the Commission? Here, were they ayatollahs of austerity or ministers of moderation? Certainly ayatollahs of austerity, one could argue, from 2010 to 2012. They were enforcers in the European semester, and in the Troika, they were enforcers for the Eurogroup, except, on the other hand, as ministers of moderation, in particular from 2013 on, well, you could see the Commission as between a rock, Northern Europe, and a hard place, Southern Europe. In particular, as output failed, they sought to provide more throughput flexibility, and that's obviously in terms of giving derogations on the rules to France and Italy once and then again, recalculating the numbers for Spain so that it didn't end up in trouble. But importantly, the Commissioner Olli Rehn's discourse was still Ayatollah-like until we get a change in commission in 2015. So that's a kind of hiding the truth. And what about the parliament? I know you're all waiting for this. And here the question is, was this a talking shop with no size at all? Or rather a increasingly equal partner? On the talking shop, yes, the parliament was most input legitimate, but how much? Certainly it was sidelined in the crisis. It had very little input, little effect on output. I mean, we can talk about the six-pack, but basically national parliaments on top of that had no input, no output, and little throughput. However, over time, one could argue, I think successfully, that the European Parliament became an increasingly equal partner in terms of legislative input versus the co-decision making process. It became increasingly the go-to body for input legitimacy. Certainly the ECB and the Commission were going to it on a regular basis, and it had an increasingly critical voice in reports and hearings, etc. But this was all about procedural evaluation. What about performance and politics as ultimate arbiters on this? Because as I've said earlier, throughput legitimacy is one piece of this. And of course, what really counts or ultimately counts is output performance and input legitimacy, or how the people perceive the performance, because they often don't even see the procedural. So what about the effectiveness of the policy ideas? And here I'm going to go very quickly. Failures in framing and diagnosis. It was a crisis of private debt, and yet it was framed as public debt. Therefore, the diagnosis, the misdiagnosis, became its behavioral problem. People weren't following the rules, as opposed to a structural problem of the euro. And then we had a bad choice of remedies and a lack of solutions. What you saw was a doubling down on the rules, no fiscal solidarity, et cetera, et cetera. And policy performance and outcomes, not good. I can come back to this later. In terms of input legitimacy, again, problematic. Rising Euroscepticism, declining trust. It was the socioeconomics of people feeling left behind, the sociocultural issues related to a loss of status, the politics of take back control that led to increasing political polarization, the decline of mainstream parties, the increasing cycling of governments, and the rise of the populist Eurosceptic extremes, suggesting that the Eurozone crisis was a big problem. So what about legitimacy during COVID-19? After all, if I develop these criteria, I need to be able to say that these are not simply applicable to the Eurozone crisis, but they can be applied more generally. So what happens during the COVID-19 crisis? Initially, this was the Eurozone crisis déjà vu all over again. The member states pursue their own policies, they violate, and this goes beyond it, they violate the Stability and Growth Pact on the deficits, ending budgetary austerity with big infusions, they violate the Schengen rules. This looks like the migration crisis redux. The Council is unaccountable, fails to act. The ECB claims it's not in its mandate to deal with the spreads between German and Italian bonds. The Commission is nowhere, and the European Parliament has no role. Fortunately, this changes very quickly. EU governing authority actually, as we see, actually develops more citizen trust, and we see in governing activities more throughput and output legitimacy. The Council becomes a mutually accountable deliberative body without diktats. The Franco-German duo is back. Okay, there are the frugal four, but nonetheless, we see a major break in taboos against EU-level debt. The ECB is the hero without any ogre-like qualities this time. It reverses all austerity without any quid pro quos, and the Commission become ministers of moderation without any Ayatollah-like characteristics. They suspend the deficit and deficit rules. They suspend state aid rules. They create SURE. They propose a bigger European recovery fund, an EU for health, and the European Parliament. Is it more of an equal partner, is still a talking shop? I think what we could say is in the beginning, it's still a talking shop, but by the time we get the budgetary negotiations, this is tremendously important. It becomes more of an equal partner. However, we need to remember it has no oversight role in the Resilience and Recovery Fund or in the national programs. So nonetheless, I think what could say is that the EU actually reversed some of the major problems of the Eurozone crisis, especially with the temporary fund, et cetera. But I guess, and this is my final remarks, is can this last? And to my mind, and maybe this also speaks to the conference on the future of Europe, policies need to have to be rethought. There needs to be not simply a temporary fund. At least we've broken the taboo for EU-level debt. But what one needs is to establish a permanent fund with a serious EU budget. More EU-owned resources to fund the green transition and the digital transformation and to address inequalities. And the ECB needs to become something of a real lender of last resort. And needless to say, we still need individual deposit insurance. On top of that, one needs to permanently suspend or at least reform the Eurozone debt and deficit rules in the European semester. At best, if you keep them, they need to be guidelines or targets, standards in Olivier Blanchard's terms, a golden rule according to others, for regular expenditures outside the investments in growth-enhancing areas, but there needs to be serious investment in all of these for the green transition, for the digital, and also physical infrastructure that's been crumbling for many years now under austerity. But as part of this, one needs to democratize the European semester. I'll talk about this later if anyone's interested. Revise the state aid rules so that they don't interfere with the kinds of investment that needed, including in terms of protecting infant industries. And while we're at it, please do something about that taxation rules and corporate taxation. This is just ridiculous, especially if one wants to talk about having a level playing field in the single market. And finally, democracy. There need to be more avenues for input. How about ending the unanimity rule with supermajorities, having supermajorities with opt-outs, or following Jean-Claude Piris, whom I just heard the other day, who wants to keep unanimity in a few vital areas, but otherwise have multilaterals outside the treaties, enhance cooperation, etc. I tend to call this a soft core Europe, not two-speed, not hardcore, or a Europe of clubs, but multiple clusters of member states and overlapping policy communities where everyone's in the single market, and most countries are in most areas, but everyone should have voice and vote in all the areas in which they participate, otherwise only vote. And I could go on, citizens' assembly, grand débat, etc., but I think I'll leave that to conclude. The question is, what next? Basically, there's still some way to go. The populist revolt is not over. Governing by rules and ruling by numbers in the eurozone have only been suspended, not officially revoked. And watch out for the Austerians. The frugal 4+ could very well come back in 2 to 3 years. The eurozone still lacks the necessary instruments to ensure optimal performance, but the response to COVID-19 reverses at least some of the worst legitimacy lapses of the eurozone crisis. So at least we're off to a very good start. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Vivien, and thank you for getting us off to a very good start with that brilliant expose, and thank you for sharing the thinking that's at the core of your book. And Jim Cloos is going to give his reflections on having read the book. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you, Vivien, for a very vivid presentation, a very balanced one, I have to say too. First of all, let me say this is a very ambitious book in 3 parts. Conceptualizing legitimacy, throughput legitimacy in the eurozone crisis, and output and input legitimacy the same. I must say I like the second part best because it provides a very thorough and thoughtful analysis of how the eurozone crisis unfolded and was handled. What you write and just said about this should really make us think about our policies and our principles. The slow response, the almost exclusive focus, at least initially, on public profligacy rather than excessive private spending, the rigidity of the system, and the weaknesses of the balance between the economic part and the monetary part of EMU are all issues we should take to heart. I will, as always, speak as a practitioner and from a personal standpoint, which means that I'm less interested in concepts than in actual policies. Having said that, I will start with the concepts because I think they are useful to structure the debate and deepen reflection. This is certainly true about what Vivien calls input and output legitimacy and throughput legitimacy, which I find on the whole convincing. I think it's a very good way of reading things and saying certain things. I have an interrogation, I have to say to Vivien, a question. On the way output legitimacy is defined and used, is there indeed as clear a direct link between policy choices and legitimacy? It's a genuine question I have. Isn't it the case that you can have a perfectly legitimate government whose policy choices are wrong and lead to negative results? Or more importantly, not everybody agrees on what the best policy options are, nor on their effects. I say this because Vivien clearly considers that the policy choices of the EU were just plain wrong at the beginning and hence delegitimized the EU. Her views are certainly shared by many people, including in the EU, and I respect that. She's more of a Keynesian And she very much approved the change of tack in 2015, 14 and 15 under Juncker. And I would also say it was very much a change of tone within the European Council. But does that mean that the EU was suddenly more legitimate? I personally also liked the change of tone in 2014, to be very honest with you. But I'm less negative on the time before. After all, the leaders applied what the treaty said and what had been agreed by all over the years before in terms of the Stability and Growth Pact. And I, for one, continue to think that criteria are important and that avoiding excessive deficits and debt is too. Vivien talks a lot about austerity and how bad it is and how stupid it is and all of that. I am much more nuanced on this because for a simple reason. If you look at the COVID crisis, it shows that countries that are in a better position as far as deficits and debt is concerned are much better equipped for handling the crisis. At some stage you quote Mr. Varoufakis as saying that Dijsselbloem was arguably the worst president of the Eurogroup. Well, I think, if I may be a bit brutal, that he was definitely the worst finance minister I have ever seen. But I know he's very popular in certain academic circles. Now, many of the criticisms directed under this concept of output legitimacy against the EU could in fact be addressed to many governments of countries across the world. I sometimes have the impression that it's only when it comes to the EU that its very nature is called into question, when the economy takes a nosedive, or when there are problems with vaccines, for instance, as there are, unfortunately. We are constantly being compared to the US and almost always as lacking this or that. We are not the United States of Europe, and we have to accept that. Actually, I personally am not in favor of the United States of Europe. But poverty and inequality, while they are a problem in Europe, they are a bigger problem in the United States. The constant and massive injections of funds and creations of more dollars over the years in the United States has certainly helped manage crises. But in the long term, I'm not as sure that this constant fuite en avant is the right way to go about the economy and its sustainability. I am in that context, and I think Vivien to some extent alluded to this, worried about the time after the recovery fund and the quantitative easing, when we are supposed to get back to a more normal management of the economy. I am afraid that the transition could become fairly rough indeed. Now, talking about concepts, I cannot help, this is less a question actually, this is more a remark. There are some concepts which I find less helpful, and there's a lot about intergovernmentalism and particularly new intergovernmentalism in this book. I must say, I don't know what it means. And I'm very puzzled by reading that there seem to be new international intergovernmental scholars. I don't know what they do in life. Now, I think that more seriously, there is a misunderstanding about the EU, what it is. Because we are a union where competences are transferred by member states in varying shapes and forms, you have exclusive competences, you have mixed competences, you have complementary ones. You have areas where you do legislation and the community method applies, which you are familiar with. Then you have areas where the treaty just foresees intergovernmental cooperation, like for the CFSP. In those cases, the Council functions intergovernmentally. In the others, it is a community institution. This is a point I frequently make. Economic coordination has elements of the two, of course. The Eurogroup certainly functions in an intergovernmental way, but the legislation which normally follows from it is subject to the normal community method. Then you have the European Council, which is a special animal. The European Council has always functioned intergovernmentally and by consensus. There is nothing new about that, and it has actually proved that it has, since its beginning in 1974, allowed the union to make major leaps because it has been present in all of the big decisions. But as Van Middelaar shows in his excellent books, it is more than an intergovernmental club. It is an in-between system, not least also because the president of the Commission is an integral part of it. We should not forget this. I would say, incidentally, that if you look at the book, Vivien, I think it would help to more clearly separate Council and European Council because they are quite different animals. And you sometimes use the term council. I mean, we all do this actually when we use shorthand. But I think it is very important. By the way, may I say something about the council and slay one of the dragons which meets me all the time? You write somewhere, and it's something which is always repeated, I'm sorry, Anthony, by many members of the European Parliament, that there is formal secrecy of all council meetings. That's what we are writing. Now, that is entirely incorrect. When the council discusses legislation, the documents which are being discussed are made public before the meeting, and the meeting is streamlined live. I'm sorry to make this point, but I'm a bit, because I see this all the time. We've always been saying it's a black box. No, it's not a black box, certainly not when there's legislation. As far as the European Council is concerned, you briefly mentioned this question, and I thought you did it in a very elegant way. Is Germany a dictatorship or not? Of course, for me, the answer is obvious. Germany is not a dictator in the European Union, nor is the German Chancellor. It's not her style. It is, of course, a key player, especially when it provides most of the national funds, which have helped a certain number of countries. And the Bundestag has all the right to be difficult here. I think, incidentally, overall, I think the role of national parliaments is very important, because the people who represent their countries in the European Council or in the Council are, of course, controlled by their political majority. Now, my next question is, can an organization like the EU be legitimate? I say this because very often when I hear arguments, and even some parts or some expressions in the book, not the book as such, because Vivien is far too nuanced for this, but sometimes I get the impression that you can only have real legitimacy if you're a state with a parliament which constitutes a government, or via direct democracy. We talk a lot about citizens and all that. The problem with citizens, unfortunately, in democracies is that when you have 100 citizens, you have 110 different opinions. So politicians still have to find a way to make sense out of this. For me, and you say this, it's very interesting what you say about split level legitimacy. I think this is entirely right. I think our institutional framework and the repetition of powers reflects the fact that we are both a union of sovereign states and of peoples. I do not believe personally that there is a structural democratic deficit. This does not at all mean that everything functions perfectly well. There are many grey zones. The Parliament often, and to some extent rightfully, criticizes those grey areas. We have a problem with executive capacity, as the crisis has shown, but it's my firm conviction that we can address those questions without creating a superstate. A last point, I was struck by what you said about the European Parliament, because at some stage you talk about a certain problem with the legitimacy, and you give two reasons. The first one is a low voters' turnout. There, I must say, I'm sorry, if you compare the voters' turnout of the EP to the one in the United States, I don't think the EP is that bad. And if you add to the fact how the voters' output for national elections across Europe, it's much higher than in the United States. Yet no one ever says that the United States is not legitimate. And the other point is the following. I mean, you also seem to imply that because there have been many Eurosceptics last time, there is a problem with legitimacy. Now that, for me, is a bit of a problematic. I am not at all in agreement with Eurosceptics, but it's democracy. And if they're being elected, they are absolutely legitimate to say that they hate the European Union. I see nothing wrong with that. Just try to apply this kind of yardstick to Trump's America. We'd have to declare America, from our point of view, as fierce contesters of what Trump is, as illegitimate. My last point is a very interesting question you are raising, and it's about differentiation as a recipe for the future in this particular instance. This is an interesting question. There is a big debate going on. Also, TEPSA has a very lot of research on this. I saw recently Jean-Claude Piris had a certain number of ideas about this. It is definitely an interesting idea because differentiation has been a very useful tool which we've used to overcome stalemates and blockages. So it's logical to see whether there is a response here. I see at least one big problem in this particular item, and that is the following. While differentiation was mostly used in the past to allow for more integration over time, what you seem to propose, but maybe I misread it, is using it for some kind of disintegration in policies that are already quite integrated, like the euro. It seems to me actually that the crises of the last years, all of them, including the external crisis, Georgia and Ukraine, actually point to the need for more integration, not less. The difference between member countries in the eurozone, as you rightly point out, are what makes the management of this crisis so difficult. Because there are very different levels of development, we know this. That is why all the moves done over the past years in all the crises has been towards more integration and unification of policies. For instance, I mean, you talked yourself about the eurozone. If you look at migration, we have massively beefed up our joint work on the policing of external borders, for instance, and beefed up Frontex. In COVID, we have created a recovery fund. The European Central Bank has even gone further in terms of buying bonds and things like that. So here, I think that I think the response cannot be, particularly as far as the euro is concerned, it's just too difficult to do this. We are too different. We cannot manage this together. So let's find a way to allow differentiation so that the Southerners manage their economy in a completely different way. It's not, I mean, this is something we have to be a bit careful about, because with a single currency, I continue to believe that that's not the right recipe. Now, on the euro, for me, it is a fact and it will remain. You say at some stage that most American economists consider that the euro was doomed from the start. Yes, I know this. They will probably still say that in 50 years' time. It's a bit the mirror image of when people talk about the future of Brazil. They say Brazil has a great future. And then 20 years later, they say Brazil has a great future. Here we turn it around and say the euro is doomed. In 20 years, we'll say, and the euro will be doomed in 10 years' time. And it goes on and on. I don't think it's doomed at all. I think we can make it work, even with our slightly complicated system. I think the COVID crisis, as you rightly say, has shown that the Union has learned from mistakes in the past, has acted actually quite fast this time in the COVID crisis, and has done things which no one, me included, did not think possible even a year ago. So for me, it shows that our system is not completely flawed. I think it does deliver, it can deliver. The problem is, of course, to take the right political decisions. Now, my final remark is simply to say that I asked some questions which I had when reading this fascinating book. That is what good books should do. They should make you reflect and ask questions, including difficult ones. I think it's thought-provoking, it's superbly researched, and it presents a brilliant analysis of the eurozone crisis. In short, I think that people who are responsible for European politics should all read it, and they should use the good arguments which are in it to get better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. You've posed a number of really quite pertinent questions, and as we're more or less on time, sometimes we run significantly late at this stage, what I'm going to do is ask Vivien if she'd like to come back in a quick fire way on any or all of the points which Jim has just raised, and then we're opening out to Q&A. We've already got 2 questions in. I also have a couple of questions I'd like to pose myself if the clock permits. So over to you, Vivien.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Jim, for what wonderful comments. I basically agree with you. But let me just go through the range of questions that you raised and comments, because I think there's a lot that can be said that can go deeper in all of this. And I should note that as the book was going to press, the COVID-19 crisis hit. And in fact, I couldn't do I'd have loved to be able to say something more, to write more. So all I could do was change the first line of the preface, which at the time read, the Eurozone crisis is arguably the EU's worst crisis ever or in the past decade, and obviously not. So I was able to change that with the exception of the COVID-19 crisis, the Eurozone. So yes, so that's important. So you asked a really important question about legitimacy, and it's one that I really thought hard about. And that's why I bring up thinking about the EU in terms not just of governing activities, but governing authority. And governing authority is really at its basis. And in that way, I think one could certainly say that the EU does not have that big a democratic deficit, as you, I think, rightly suggest. I mean, in my 2006 book, I actually argue that the question of the democratic deficit is really not about the EU level, it's about the national level. That what do we do about national democracies as more and more decisions go up to the EU level? That's really where I see the major problem, and a problem that has not been effectively dealt with, which might help explain the rise of Euroscepticism, actually. So I'm not going to blame the EU for the rise of Euroscepticism, although arguably I would say that the Eurozone crisis fueled fueled the rise of Eurosceptic parties, anti-system parties. And also what we saw is in the midst of that crisis, mainstream parties were falling apart, largely because they weren't sufficiently responsive. So it's really, so what I'm really saying is that one needs to remember it's also, even though the book is all about governing activities, one should not forget governing authority. And basically, you can have wrong policies and governments can continue to have governing authority. So they continue to have legitimacy in terms of governing authority, but have problematic governing policies for a long time and bad throughput procedures and non-responsiveness, and you undermine governing authority. So I think that's really, I'm glad you asked that question, you raised it, because that's a really important point here. Now, on your comparison with the US, I am in total agreement. In any of the questions one wants to ask about the US and its lack of legitimacy, I would agree. I think it is, as we've seen with the rise of Trump, et cetera, the US has almost as bad, if not worse in some ways, a system of government than the EU. It is also affected by gridlock, the impossibility of doing anything, and it's a nation state. And what you saw is I even wrote this somewhere, that if you compare the US and the EU, I argue that the US was better able to deal with the Eurozone crisis, its economic crisis, than the EU, because it's a national state. It has a federal government with a treasury where it raises taxes, where it can redistribute. And in that way, it was able to move quickly and solve the problem, although not entirely solved, much better than the EU. That's for the economic crisis. But the political crisis, the EU is saved by having member states, many different member states with input legitimacy at the national level. You can't, you cannot have an accident or even an accident waiting to happen like Trump in the EU, but you can have Trump. It should never have happened, but it happened as he essentially took over the Republican Party, and we had Trump for 4 years. And we're only lucky, I mean, it's dans un mouchoir that Trump didn't get reelected, since generally they do, if you're an incumbent. So, we can thank our lucky stars in terms of the US. So EU-US comparison, I think it's important. The EU, because of its lack of a political status as a nation state, was essentially saved a Trumpian moment. I also agree with you that the EU is not a future nation state. I've used the term, that was in the 2006 book as well, thinking about the EU as a region state, where you can have ever deepening European integration at the same time that you'll continue to have ever differentiating national state, sort of nation states. And I think that's fine. The question becomes, as you rightly say, how do we work with this and figure out ways to move forward in the EU. Your next comment about new intergovernmentalism, and, sorry about this. This is a book not just for policy people and, people who know the institutions and all of that, but also for scholars. And so I did have to respond to the scholarly debates, and I'm in total agreement with you. That's why I sort of tried to get through them as quickly as possible and just say, look, let's just look at all of this as, increasingly politicized dynamics of interaction. And what's really important are the dynamics of interaction amongst all these various actors. And so you described it perfectly. I'm not going to go there. And thank you for the comment on formal secrecy. I think that was a slip. As you rightly said, I use European Council. I just try to, there are limits to how much detail I can provide in this big book, but I mean, there are bound to be certain issues there. And I agree with you. I mean, that Germany is not a dictator. I used it partially because I wanted the most extreme kinds of statements, of ways of thinking about this. And I want to leave it actually up to the reader to decide what they think. That's why I sort of laid out all these arguments. But I can say that sort of rationalist scholars, most of that literature has been about Germany as the dictator, acting in its own interest, as the leader of the creditor's country, destroying, poor Southern Europe. And as you said, and as I wrote, there is a whole other side. This was about deliberate. This is about reaching mutually accountable agreements, even if they're not the best policies. You're absolutely right that there's a whole history of this. It makes perfect sense that that's what they did. Nonetheless, I wish they had done something else. So yeah, just moving on. I think I've answered many of these. Yes. Okay. I think the economics is important. And it's important because, yes, one could argue I'm a neo-Keynesian, but basically I just want things to work. And I think what we saw with what happened in the eurozone is those austerity policies did not work because you did not get the kind of investment in growth that you needed, that Southern European countries really just continued on decline. I have all sorts of charts and graphs showing that. And there was another way to do this. And essentially that's what my argument is. But as you said, the union learned from its mistakes in ways that none of us thought possible. It could deliver, and hopefully the temporary fund will become a permanent fund. That's where it needs to get for Europe. This is not just about the eurozone, but for Europe to move forward. The world, but also Europe, is facing massive problems in terms of climate change, in terms of lack of access to we can see this lack of access to digital platforms. I'm talking to you from the Italian coast, and I'm amazed that I haven't had a rupture in the Zoom, because generally speaking, I have to move back and forth between my regular internet connection and my iPhone because it's so bad here. These are the things, the Europe is massively behind because it didn't do what it needed to do in terms of investing. And part of it is because, you got the refrain constantly, even after 2015. Those countries without the fiscal space, of course, can't do any more, but those with the fiscal space should invest. Well, no one invested. Those with the fiscal space did not spend. Those without it couldn't, which meant that and you commented about this, that some countries did well, were able to respond. Well, they were Northern Europe, because in fact Northern Europe generally did well in the crisis. Southern Europe did not, and it didn't get the kind of investment. This is not to say that it didn't need structural reform, just not those particular structural reforms. It certainly needed to deal with corruption, with collecting taxes, with streamlining its bureaucracy and all of that, but instead with that focus, like, headline goal of fiscal consolidation. In the first 5 years, it meant that no investment happened, and that even good reforms suggested by the Commission weren't done because everyone thought you had to cut and cut and cut. And once you cut, you don't have room, as Mario Monti himself found, to do anything more than that. So part of the reason, and fortunately there's, I think, a recognition, if only tacit, in the EU, part of the problem, part of the reason that you end up with a shift is a recognition that actually Southern Europe was in deeper trouble and it didn't have the health capacity, et cetera, that it should have, largely because it had been going through years of austerity and cuts in, in healthcare, in all of the rest. So yeah, I think I should probably stop right there and hand it over back to Anthony.
Thank you very much indeed for that terrific exchange between Vivien and Jim. We've got almost 90 people online at the moment. We peaked at just under 100, and we've already got at least 3, arguably more questions that have come in from various colleagues who are in the digital audience. And I'm going to just group 3 of those together to give you an opportunity to come back on those elements which interest you or provoke you in these comments. The first is from Bettina de Souza, who asks, you set out in your analysis there a kind of checklist for potential reform. In this, how far does the democratization of the European semester feature, or would you radically alter the European semester? And so what is the place in effect of those kind of collective governance rules as you see a successful Eurozone going forward? A second question is from Henry Palm, who makes the point that, and it's probably the case for most of the people on the call today, that we have a political elite which is predominantly full of people who've got postgraduate degrees. He calls it diploma democracy. Various political scientists have already picked up on this. I think Vernon Bogdanor in Britain's talked about the reaction against the exam passing classes, basically people like us. Michael Sandel at Harvard has talked about the revolt against meritocracy. How far do you attribute the rise of populism over time to that kind of reaction, a feeling of otherness on the part of those people who've been successful within the system? Which of course raises other questions. I mean, the rise of populism which you point to, I mean, how far was that specifically linked to the Eurozone debt crisis in the countries concerned? In fact, actually, some of the countries most significantly hit didn't see the rise of populist parties, or if they did, they tended to be populist parties of the left rather than of the right. So what exactly was going on there? Or how far was it more to do with other factors like the economic and financial crisis itself, which after all predated the Eurozone debt crisis, security and terrorism issues, migration issues, and so on. And then Gonzalez Rodriguez asks a very interesting question, I think, about legitimacy through identity. How far is it necessary to feel part of the same political community in order for the system's outcomes to be legitimate? And how far down that road do you think the European Union is? And is the EU approaching, you talked about a Trumpian moment, but is it approaching either the famous Hamiltonian moment or perhaps more interestingly, the Machiavellian moment that I think, quoting Pocock, I think it is, that Luc van Middelaar talks about, when a system chooses in effect to take control of its own destiny. So maybe over to Vivien first.
Great set of questions. Yeah, thank you. So first to Bettina de Souza. Yeah, I'm really pleased you asked this question because I've actually worked a lot on thinking about how one reforms the European semester. And I started saying something about suspending or at least reforming the Eurozone debt and deficit rules, using them only as guidelines or targets. And I have that in the conclusion, even though what we've seen is that most people are now saying, yes, we need to, well, Olivier Blanchard and others We need standards, a golden rule. But beyond that, and I think that's all absolutely right, because I don't actually, the European semester is an amazing architecture of coordination. I'm not suggesting to get rid of that, but I'm saying that rather than this seemingly top-down setup where the Commission appeared to tell the member states what to do, even though the truth is much more complicated than that, and member states often uploaded what they wanted, which were then downloaded, but the appearance was actually highly hierarchical and undemocratic. That's one thing. So what I've argued is that you need to democratize the European semester by making it more bottom-up than top-down. That we need to think industrial policy councils rather than fiscal councils, that there could be even differential targets for the member states depending upon where they are in the business cycle, as opposed to kind of one size fits all. So a much more nuanced way of thinking about the European semester. What's really interesting, of course, is that COVID-19 has actually changed the Eurozone, the European semester dramatically. And in some ways, I could argue, might argue that it's actually become bottom up, because the member states now, the main focus of the European semester is on member states in their national resilience and recovery plans, essentially saying, here's what we want to do. To democratize this appropriately, it's not only the sort of half of this is the member states say, this is what we want, but it should be that process of national development of the resilience, of the national resilience and recovery funds, recovery plans, should actually themselves be democratized. Bring in the social partners, bring in civil society to try to figure out, how do we move forward? This might actually work with the Conference on the Future of Europe to think about how one uses citizens' assemblies and various other, and the Grand Débat and various other means to get citizens' opinions in there, but also civil society organizations, unions where they still exist, and collectives of workers, but also obviously management, to figure out where do you invest and how do you do it. But as part of this, and I just briefly touched on this, one also needs to revise the state aid rules, because clearly the way in which they're set up now and administered would make it much harder for appropriate kinds of industrial policies that say, we need to move in this direction, we need perhaps to protect infant industries, as was done in the 1950s and 60s, in order to let them grow, et cetera. And then in the book, I do talk about to recognize there are very different national varieties of capitalism, different growth models, and it's actually at the national level that people understand that. And that the real problem with the Eurozone crisis and these one-size-fits-all rules, as they were applied, is that it made it very hard for member states to move forward. I think the best example of this is member states were told, you need structural reforms to become, as good at export orientation as the Germans and the Dutch, etc. Fine. And then they were told, so deregulate your labor markets, crush the unions. Well, wait a minute. The strength of export-oriented economies in Northern Europe has to do with the fact that they've got strong unions that can talk to management and strong management organizations. It's about corporatism. Well, what happens with the structural reforms that were put into place and that were demanded of sort of the Southern Europeans in particular, but not exclusively, were, basically crush the very organizations, the unions, that could make it possible for you to move up the value chain in terms of competitiveness, if you will. So that's a very long response to question one. Then the next on the political elites and the postgraduate degrees, diploma democracy, linked to the rise of populism, and it's a very important question. And I should say that I'm in the midst of writing another book essentially focused on populism. But my chapter 10 really does sort of at first cut at this. And there's no question that, even what do we call populism is problematic. But there's certainly left and right-wing varieties. The right-wing varieties tend to be exclusive. They tend to focus primarily, the message before the Eurozone crisis was all anti-immigration, with some anti-Europe and all anti-Europe because of immigration, anti-Euro, but that really picks up. And if you look at various grants and charts graphs and charts that talk about that show you what happened, is that you see a sort of a gradual rise from the 1980s, and then a plateau in the early 2000s when the euro is doing well and everyone's feeling prosperous. And then the minute the even financial crisis, depending upon which country, financial crisis or eurozone crisis, then you get a massive rise in populism. What's interesting is that the COVID-19, the sort of silver lining, the only silver lining, I hate even to say this, but a silver lining in the COVID-19 crisis is the fact that trust in the EU has increased. Perhaps it'll have dipped because of the vaccine thing, but once people forget that, it'll be back up. But increased trust in European authority, and also opinion polls show that European citizens want the EU to have more authority and more capability in terms of health, in terms of other things. It's always wanted a reasonably high amount in terms of security. I think that's all very important. So yes, Henry, absolutely right. It's not just about the Eurozone, but there's no question that there's been a big bump up in terms of that. And yes, it's also about terrorism. There have been so many crises. I suppose another silver lining comes from Brexit. Because with Brexit, all of these radically Eurosceptic parties on the right and the left that said, we want to leave the euro, we want to leave the EU, looking at the mess that has been Brexit in the UK, they've said, actually, no, for the most part, they've dropped it from their program. I think the AfD still has it if they think they need it, but most have simply dropped those issues. And that's because of Brexit. COVID-19, I think you'll see that sort of that EU legitimacy, and this is for Gonzalez Rodriguez, legitimacy is increasing. And then the question becomes, is identity increasing? And is it necessary? And I know there are lots of people way back when Joe Weiler said you have to have a demos, otherwise you can't have democracy and you can't have legitimacy. But I see a tangential relationship between legitimacy and identity. In particular, because you can feel more European, you use the euro, you see the flag, you have it on your license plates. So that's a kind of tacit, unconscious kind of European identity. But you can also hate the EU. So you can have an identity that is totally negative about the EU. But you can also have a positive view. So legitimacy to me is more about governing activities, and identity, although a good idea, it really helps, is something else. It's Habermas talked about the importance of political activity, that it's not this ethno-national identity thing that people used to think of as identity. But it's, let's talk about it as political identity. Let's talk about it and as engaging. This is, it's not enough to be European, you need to do European, but you also need to say it. And the problem, this is way back in my 2006 book as well, is that EU member state leaders basically don't talk as EU member state leaders, they talk as national leaders, as you, Jim, also said in your comments. And that's an issue. That until member state leaders talk as Europeans, we'll continue to be in trouble. But the interesting thing is with the COVID-19 crisis, we've got much more. This is, going back to my discussion of politicization. Politicization has been mainly negative, in particular in the Eurozone crisis, as member state leaders exchanged, criticisms at the very least. But I see a more positive side, a more positive politicization as a result of the COVID-19, where people say, hey, we have to pull together. So yes, there are problematic moments, as there have been with the vaccines, but I'm not going to blame the EU. They had no capacity before. This takes a long time to learn. And so, there are bumps in the road. But that's where Jim was absolutely right to say we need deeper integration, but at the same time, we need to be careful about where that integration occurs and not to go too far. And my sense is that the Eurozone crisis, in that crisis, with the Eurozone semester, but in particular with program countries or countries in trouble, the EU went way too far in terms of issues of sovereignty, really. And also because they were bad policies. They didn't work. So it helped fuel the rise of populism because people are saying, wait a minute, you're telling us what to do. Okay, well, it better work. And then it doesn't work. But even whether it works or not, here's the identity issue. Basically, we don't want to be told what to do. And I suppose Brexit is an example, but we're not going to talk Brexit. That will take too long. That will be another talk. I'll stop here and leave it open for more comments.
Thank you very much indeed. Over to you, Jim, for any commentary and reaction to that.
I thought very interesting questions, and I listened with great attention to what Vivien had to say very quickly on the European semester for Bettina. I think it is a useful tool, but it has to be used well. I think, for instance, this is one of the areas where I think the link both with the European Parliament and the national parliament is very important. The Commission has made quite a bit of efforts recently to, for instance, send commissioners to national parliaments to talk about those issues. I think we need more dialogue. I mean, at some stage, there was one prime minister who at the European Council said, I find it quite extraordinary that the Commission sends a head of unit to me, prime minister, and says, that's what you have to do with your fiscal policy, for instance. That's, of course, completely unacceptable. But the Commission has made big efforts in that respect. I think over the last year, the quality of the debate has really increased. And I would like to make one other point. As always, I think it's important to look at what's going on in the European Council and to use the European Council. After 2016, the language in the European Council changed on, for instance, the question of open trade, liberalism, and things like that. It has changed. They now very openly talk about industrial policy, for instance. They talk about reciprocity in trade deals. They talk about becoming much more digital and bringing things together. There is, I think, a recognition that if the EU wants to thrive in the global world with countries like the US, Russia, China, things like that, we have to get more autonomous. And that's why, for me, the debate on strategic autonomy is not at all about against NATO or defense. It's about all the other things, where the Union has to get much stronger and much more resilient. On the question of the elites, that's a difficult question. It is something which across all the Western democracies we see. Obviously, there is a growing gap between the elites. Of course, I would not, as someone who in some way seemed to belong to the elite, argue with the populists in terms of everything which everybody who has done a university degree or who is a bit of an expert should shut up. I think this goes a bit too far. But on the other hand, it's quite clear that the dominant discourse by the people who hold university degrees, people who travel, people who speak 5 languages, people who have no problem moving across the world, and the people, majority of the people who are not like that, the gap is going to be. Now, this is an economic problem. I think that the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, which had some positive elements, but I think they went over the top. I think the inequalities in our systems, in the United States first, and then in the European Union, is poisonous for us. But of course, there's also a lot of populism which is based on the feeling of being deprived of your identity. So it's much more than the economy. And to some extent, Brexit is a bit of this mixed, toxic mix. And there, I'd like to say a word about Gonzalez's question. This is a difficult question. Cultural identity. I do not know exactly what it means. For me, as a Luxembourger, my identity and my culture is being defined by German and French culture. And I think for many Europeans, and that's a good thing, I think our cultural diversity is a real asset. We should not try to create one identity out of that. And you see, I thought the way the European Union introduced at the Maastricht Treaty the EU citizenship was very clever, because it did not say, we are making you EU citizens, and that's it. They said, because you are French, because you are German or Luxembourger, you have a European citizen, which gives you a certain number of rights. That's beautiful. We should stick with this thing. My very last remark, there was not a direct question about this, but it's the question about national interests. I must say, I've been in this business for a long time. I can tell you, every single European country defends their national interests. And this is entirely logical. If you're elected, even in Luxembourg, I mean, the Luxembourgers elected to defend the Luxembourg national interest, of course. Now, the problem, the interesting thing in the European Union is that we have managed to convince a lot of people, not everybody, a lot of people, that the best way to defend your national interest is to invest in the EU interest. That's the way to do it. But sort of saying, oh God, the Germans are really terrible. I mean, the German Chancellor defended German interests. Well, of course they do. And even when the Germans pretended not to defend national interests after the Second World War, for reasons one can understand, of course they defended the German interests. Their interest at the time was to share sovereignty with the French and the others, and to get back into the family of nations. But they defended the national interest. So I do not see the European interest as divorced from the various national interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim, for that. I'm going to take advantage of the privilege of chairing this by asking a question, if I may, of Vivien, which is, back at the time of your first book, in fact, even before you published that book, you had observed about Italy in particular. I think you said in an article in 2002, you said, historically, in no other country than Italy has the discourse of European integration played such a central and sustained role in promoting acceptance of change. And I wondered how far you felt, as a result of the events that you've described in your new book, that has really been jolted out of the instinctive reflex of the Italian public and indeed the Italian political class. In other words, how far has Italy changed during the last 20 years in respect of its assumption of Europe being a good thing?
That's a wonderful question. And I've watched the Italy going from the most pro-European of countries to something, I guess I could say one of the least, certainly, recently, certainly in March of last year with the COVID response. And there are many reasons for this. We can blame Berlusconi for a part of this. We can blame the introduction of the euro, when everyone felt that the euro was inflationary, but actually you also saw that in the Netherlands, that people blamed the euro for inflation, even though that was really a national competence. But nonetheless, go back to the run-up to the euro. Italy was the only country that had a tax for Europe, where it made major reforms. This is the vincolo esterno. You call on the, you say basically this is an external constraint making us do this, and this is good for us. But we've seen over the years is as Italy's not grown, and essentially this is, a lot of the problem does have to do with the economics and the structure of the euro and the kind of growth model of Italy, but it's also about internal politics, needless to say, and the lack of important reforms in the economics. I think here, certainly, reform of bureaucracy, getting people to pay taxes. This is also about questions of trust in government authority, problems with, so lots of internal problems, but it's also the structure of the euro. And then the eurozone crisis hits, and Italy has to go into implicit conditionality. It gets, government after government, and it then gets a double populist government in 2018. With the League on the one hand on the extreme right, and the Five Star, which I call radical center because they pulled on the right and the left. And in this government, what you had were conflicting policies and proposals, et cetera. And I suppose that could be seen as the height of Euroscepticism until COVID hits, and then you get, what was it, the Dutch Minister of Finance, who talks about, basically blames Italy and Spain and other Southern European countries for not being prepared. Well, how could they be prepared when they were pushed to cut in vital areas, and they haven't had any growth to speak of? And so what's fascinating, though, is what we now see is that so very much upset about the frugal 4+, Europe is abandoning us. Why do we need Europe? But then Europe came through. There are historians who are going to have to tell us exactly why Merkel changed her mind. I've seen some people argue that it's because of the Constitutional Court decision, but I rather think of it as lots of really good diplomatic work on the part of France at the ministry level, as well as Macron talking to Merkel on a regular basis. But really importantly, Merkel got it, that this is actually about the interdependence of the EU, that you could talk about economic interests, and Jim, you're absolutely right. These are ideas about interest, and you can talk about narrow self-interest and not see that actually what is in your real interest is being part of the EU in all sorts of ways. And so for Merkel's change of mind, we could say that it's about economic interest, as Bavarian automakers said, listen, if we lose suppliers in northern Italy, it's all over for us. You could see it also as was a different kind of crisis. This is a symmetric crisis. This is about health. This is humanitarian. Think about Merkel responding to the nuclear, to Fukushima. No more nuclear power. Think how she responded to the Syrian refugee crisis, where in fact she said, we will take them in because it's humanitarian. So I think there must have been a change of mind, a change of heart, and a change of understanding in all of that. But with that, with this temporary resilience and recovery fund, Italians saw, and with much of the money, at least initially suggested, going to Italy, the Italians said, okay. But there's still very basic, there's a certain amount of mistrust. And you saw that in that government, including in the 5-star, even when the League was out, in that they didn't want to take any money from the European Stability Mechanism because that was seen as endangering them with conditionality, and admittedly very minimal conditionality, but for them, given the Greek crisis, given the whole eurozone crisis, there's no way they were going to trust the EU not to come back and say, look, your debt is too high again. I think what's important to note about debt, and this is something that Jim said before about worry about debt. My view is the only way you get out of debt is through investment and growth. You can never cut your way out of debt. Austerity doesn't work. So I think the only hope for the EU and for the US and elsewhere is to find ways to invest in the future that make it possible for Europe to move ahead, to create new jobs so that you get rid of new jobs that mean that it's not just the diploma, people with diplomas get jobs, but also everyday workers, who can start installing, new digital whatevers, electricity, for electric cars, all of that stuff. I mean, it seems to me that's the only way. And invest in education. Italy's not invested in education, and the best and the brightest in Italy have gone to Brussels and work, among other places. I mean, I think that's so I think that more than answers your question.
Well, thank you very much. We've now come more or less to the end of the allotted time. I know one or two people still want to come in. There was a nice question came in from Oscar Pedersen with a D. For jazz fans, it's not Oscar Peterson. In the chat, in which he said or asked, what role does the media play in the legitimacy of the EU, and to what degree does the absence of a common debate across the EU state borders affect the legitimacy of the Union as a whole? It's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't think we've really got time to answer it, but obviously if we had a pan-European media, it would help. Jim, thank you so much for your very acute critique and probing of our guest speaker. Thank you, Vivien, for choosing to spend the time with us, which we really appreciate, coming back for a second time. Next time, your next book, we'll be certain to renew that invitation if we may, especially if it's on a subject which is so central as populism to the politics of the European Union. It just remains for me not only to express our collective thanks on behalf of all those who've been on this call to our two speakers, but also to alert you to the fact we'll be having another roundtable tomorrow, EPRS policy roundtable at 2 o'clock Central European time inside the new European Bauhaus, how to design and build a more sustainable future. The Bauhaus is a fantastically interesting new project that's just come out of the European Commission, and we'll be having not only members and policymakers more generally, but also practitioners on the ground, architects, designers and town planners, talking about the implications of the Bauhaus initiative. And then a week tomorrow, in conjunction with the former Members Association here in the European Parliament, we'll be doing an analysis of 40 years of Greece's EU membership, looking back at the situation when Greece joined, and we've just published, in fact, a history of the accession process, and looking at the way that Greek membership has played out both for Greece and for the European Union collectively. So that's a week tomorrow. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a great pleasure to host this, and thank you most especially to Vivien SCHMIDT. It's been terrific once again to renew our understanding of your extremely interesting and insightful thoughts about the nature of the EU political system, and to Jim, now freed in retirement, to critique that so effectively and stimulatingly as you did. So thank you so much to both of you, and thank you everybody else. Have a very nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Jim.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks, Vivien. Bye.